2. Life at Limmeridge House. When I got up the next morning, I was greeted by bright sunlight and a view of blue sea through the window. The future suddenly seemed full of promise. I found my way down to the breakfast room, and there, looking out of a window with her back turned to me, was a young woman with a perfect figure. But when she turned and walked towards me, I saw to my surprise that her face was ugly. Hair grew on her upper lip, and her mouth was large and firm. It was almost a man's face, but the friendly smile she gave me softened it and made her look more womanly. She welcomed me in a pleasant, educated voice and introduced herself as Marian Halcombe, Miss Fairley's half-sister. My mother was twice married, she explained in her easy, friendly manner. The first time to Mr. Halcombe, my father, and the second time to Mr. Fairley, my half-sister's father. My father was a poor man, and Miss Fairley's father was a rich man. I've got nothing, and she has a fortune. I'm dark and ugly, and she's fair and pretty. She said all this quite happily. My sister and I are very fond of each other, so you must please both of us, Mr. Hartright, or please neither of us. She then told me that Miss Fairley had a headache that morning and was being looked after by Mrs. Vesey, an elderly lady who had once been Miss Fairley's governess. "So we shall be alone at breakfast, Mr. Hartright," she said. "As for Mr. Fairley, your employer, you will doubtless meet him later. He is Miss Fairley's uncle, a single man who became Miss Fairley's guardian when her parents died. He suffers from some mysterious illness of the nerves and never leaves his rooms." While we ate breakfast, she described the quiet, regular life that she and her sister led. "Do you think you will get used to it?" she said, "or will you be restless and wish for some adventure?" Hearing the word adventure reminded me of my meeting with the woman in white and her reference to Mrs. Fairley. I told Miss Halcombe all about my adventure, and she showed an eager interest, especially in the mention of her mother. "But you didn't find out the woman's name?" she said. "I'm afraid not, only that she came from Hampshire." "Well, I shall spend the morning," said Miss Halcombe, "looking through my mother's letters. I'm sure I will find some clues there to explain this mystery. Lunch is at 2 o'clock, Mr. Hartright, and I shall introduce you to my sister then." After breakfast, Mr. Fairley's personal servant, Lewis, came to tell me that Mr. Fairley would like to see me. I followed the servant upstairs and was shown into a large room full of art treasures. There, in an armchair, sat a small, pale, delicate-looking man of about 50. Despite his fine clothes and the valuable rings on his soft white fingers, there was something very unattractive about him. "So glad to have you here, Mr. Hartright," he said in a high, complaining voice. "Please sit down, but don't move the chair. In my state of nerves, any movement is painful to me. And may I ask if you have found everything satisfactory here at Limmeridge?" When I began to reply, he at once raised his hand to stop me. "Please excuse me, but could you speak more softly? I simply cannot bear loud voices, or indeed any kind of loud sound." The interview did not last long, as Mr. Fairley quickly lost interest in it. He informed me that the ladies would make all the arrangements for their drawing lessons. "I suffer so much from my nerves, Mr. Hartright," he said. "Do you mind ringing the bell for Lewis? Thank you. Good morning." With great relief, I left the room and spent the rest of the morning looking forward to lunchtime, where I would be introduced to Miss Fairley. At 2 o'clock I entered the dining room and found Miss Halcombe seated at the table with a rather fat lady who smiled all the time. This, I discovered, was Mrs. Vesey. We started eating, and before long we had finished lunch, with still no signs of Miss Fairley. Miss Halcombe noticed my frequent glances at the door. "I understand you, Mr. Hartright," she said. "You're wondering about your other student. Well, she has got over her headache, but did not want any lunch. If you will follow me, I think we can find her somewhere in the garden." We walked out together along a path through the garden until we came to a pretty summer house. Inside I could see a young lady standing near a table, looking out at the view and turning the pages of a little drawing book. This was Miss Laura Fairley. How can I describe her? How can I separate this moment from all that has happened since then? In a drawing I later made of her, she appears as a light, youthful figure wearing a simple white and blue striped dress and a summer hat. Her hair is light brown, almost gold, and she has eyes that are clear and blue, with a look of truth in them. They give her whole face such a charm that it is difficult to notice each individual feature. The delicate, though not perfectly straight nose, the sweet, sensitive mouth. The life and beauty of her face lies in her eyes. Such was my impression, but at the same time I felt there was something about her that I could not explain, something that I ought to remember but could not. In fact, I was thinking about this so much that I could hardly answer when she greeted me. Miss Halcombe, believing I was shy, quickly said, "Look at your perfect student," and she pointed at the sketches. "She has already started work before your lessons have begun. You must show them to Mr. Hartright, Laura, when we go for a drive." Miss Fairley laughed with bright good humour. "I hope he will give his true opinion of them and not just say something to please me," she said. "May I inquire why you say that?" I asked. "Because I shall believe all that you tell me," she answered simply. In those few words she gave me the key to her own trusting, truthful character. Later we went for our promised drive, but I must confess that I was far more interested in Miss Fairley's conversation than her sketches. I soon realized I was behaving more like a guest than a drawing teacher, and when I was on my own again, I felt uneasy and dissatisfied with myself. At dinner that evening, these feelings soon disappeared, and when the meal was over, we went into a large sitting room with glass doors leading into the garden. Mrs. Vesey fell asleep in an armchair, and Miss Halcombe sat near a window to look through her mother's letters. At my request, Miss Fairley played the piano. How will I ever forget that peaceful picture? The flowers outside, the music of Mozart, Miss Halcombe reading the letters in the half-light, the delicate outline of Miss Fairley's face against the dark wall. It was an evening of sights and sounds to remember forever. Later, when Miss Fairley had finished playing and had wandered out into the moonlit garden, Miss Halcombe called me. "Mr. Hartright, will you come here for a minute?" I went over, and she showed me a letter. "It's from my mother to her second husband 12 years ago. She mentions a lady from Hampshire called Mrs. Catherick, who had come to look after her sick sister living in the village. It seems she brought her only child with her, a little girl called Anne, who was about a year older than Laura. I was in school in Paris at the time. My mother, who took a great interest in the village school, says the little girl was slow in learning, so she gave her lessons here at the house. She also gave her some of Laura's white dresses and white hats, saying she looked better in white than any other colour. She says that little Anne Catherick was so grateful and loved her so much that one day she kissed her hand and said, 'I'll always wear white as long as I live. It will help me to remember you.'" Miss Halcombe stopped and looked at me. "Did the woman you met that night seem young enough to be 22 or 23? "Yes, Miss Halcombe, as young as that. And was she dressed from head to foot all in white? All in white. From where I sat, I could see Miss Fairlie walking in the garden, and the whiteness of her dress in the moonlight suddenly made my heart beat faster. Now listen to what my mother says at the end of the letter, Miss Halcombe continued. It will surprise you. She says that perhaps the real reason for her liking little Anne Catherick so much was that she looked exactly like... Before she could finish, I jumped up. Outside stood Miss Fairlie, a white figure alone in the moonlight, and suddenly I realized what it was that I had been unable to remember. It was the extraordinary likeness between Miss Laura Fairlie and the runaway from the asylum, the woman in white. "You see it," said Miss Halcombe, "just as my mother saw the likeness between them years ago." "Yes," I replied, but very unwillingly. To connect that lonely, friendless woman, even by an accidental likeness, to Miss Fairlie disturbs me very much. I don't like to think of it. Please call her in from that horrible moonlight. "We won't say anything about this likeness to Laura," she said. "It will be a secret between you and me." Then she called Miss Fairlie in, asking her to play the piano again, and so my first eventful day at Limmeridge House came to an end. The days passed, the weeks passed, and summer changed into a golden autumn. A peaceful, happy time, but at last I had to confess to myself my real feelings for Miss Fairlie. I loved her. Every day I was near her in that dangerous closeness which exists between teacher and student. Often, as we bent over her sketchbook, our hands and faces almost touched. I breathed the perfume of her hair. I should have put a professional distance between myself and her, as I had always done with my students in the past, but I did not, and it was soon too late. By the 3rd month of my stay in Cumberland, I was lost in dreams of love and blind to the dangers ahead of me. Then the first warning finally came, from her. In the space of one night she changed towards me. There was a sudden nervous distance and a kind of sadness in her attitude. The pain I felt at that moment is beyond description. But I knew then that she had changed because she had suddenly discovered not only my feelings, but her own as well. This change was also reflected in Miss Halcombe, who said nothing unusual to me, but who had developed a new habit of always watching me. This new and awful situation continued for some time until, on a Thursday, near the end of the 3rd month, I was at last rescued by the sensible and courageous Miss Halcombe. "Have you got a moment for me?" she asked after breakfast. "Shall we go into the garden?" We walked to the summer-house and went inside. Miss Halcombe turned to me. "Mr. Hartwright, what I have to say to you, I can say here. Now, I know that you are a good man who always acts correctly. Your story about that unhappy woman in London proves that. As your friend, I must tell you that I have discovered your feelings for my sister Laura. Although you have done nothing wrong, except show weakness, I must tell you to leave Limmeridge House before any harm is done. And there is something else I must tell you, which will also give you pain. Will you shake hands with your friend Marian Halcombe first?" She spoke with such kindness that I shook her hand. "You must leave because Laura Fairlie is to be married." The last word went like a bullet to my heart. I turned white. I felt cold. With one word, all my hopes disappeared. "You must put an end to your feelings here, where you first met her. I will hide nothing from you. She's not marrying for love, but because of a promise she made to her father just before he died. The man she is to marry arrives here next Monday. Let me go today, I said bitterly. The sooner the better. No, not today. That would look strange. Wait till tomorrow, after the post has arrived. Say to Mr. Fairley that you have received bad news and must return to London. I will follow your advice, Miss Halcombe, I said sadly. But may I ask who the gentleman engaged to Miss Fairley is? A rich man from Hampshire. Hampshire? Again a connection with Anne Catherick? And his name? I asked, as calmly as I could. Sir Percival Glyde. Sir. I remembered Anne Catherick's suspicious questions about baronets, and my voice shook a little as I asked, Is he a baronet? She paused for a moment, then answered, Yes, a baronet.